Up has the strongest first act in Pixar's entire history, and I don't think it's that particularly close. When people think about Up, they tend to think of the emotions evoked, the feeling of adventure, and most certainly, its opening montage. But it's not just the sentimentality and the emotion that makes Act 1 of this film especially great. Pixar has plenty of other films with emotional opening set pieces. That's like their thing. Up is also a masterclass in introducing imagery, as well as setting up plot elements to be paid off later in the story. This is actually what elevates the first act of Up to the top of the list. Just as an exercise, let's take inventory of the plot elements and imagery introduced in the first act. Balloons, Spirit of Adventure, Charles Muntz, his dogs, Paradise Falls, the club, the Ellie badge, My Adventure Book, Cross Your Heart, the house, the chairs, the mailbox, the bird on the mantle, clouds, parenthood, assisting the elderly, snipe hunting, a leaf blower, Carl's walker, the tennis balls, his hearing aid. Not bad for like 20 minutes of runtime. You foreshadowed pretty much every major plot point in the rest of the film. The only new stuff in Act 2 is the Doug-specific elements with the cone and the voice box, as well as Russell's specific backstory and climbing ability. But pretty much everything else is already here. It's just so efficiently presented. I think that's what's most remarkable about it. Pixar had to fit in basically an entire movie as its background for its protagonist. It had to fit in all these old-timey talky stuff to establish Muntz, and then meet Ellie, and then briskly show almost their entire life story. Carl's feelings for his wife, and his regrets, fuel this entire adventure, and it's paramount that we care about him. But we can't drag down the first act and make this thing a 3-hour epic. Pixar is amazingly effective with their use of a flashback followed by a montage in setting the mood and presenting all the information we need. They present Ellie as someone very likable, sympathetic, and someone worth remembering. We are totally on board with Carl's point of view on this subject. I find this to be an improvement on what Finding Nemo did with its opening with Coral. Both films open with the death of the protagonist's wife, but Up is more interested in letting Ellie be a constant presence in the film. It's not simply used as a device to set up the main character's neuroses. It festers, it haunts, it figuratively follows around Carl wherever he goes. They talk about it. Up is also extremely successful with its imagery. Right out the gate, they give little Carl a balloon with the words Spirit of Adventure on it, thereby linking the two concepts together. Balloons obviously play a huge role in the story, both in Carl and Ellie's backstory, and then later on in the main plot. A lot of the imagery representing adventure are related to the sky, that sense of flying away and getting away from it all, to go to an exotic place. In addition to balloons, there is the motif of the bird, which is scattered all throughout Act 1. Obviously the bird on the mantle to foreshadow Kevin, but other more subtle appearances. The most clever of these is their usage of the habanera aria from the opera Carmen. This is like the most perfect song they could pick right here. Ugh, it is so perfect. Not just for the staging and the sequence and the melody, but for its lyrics. Now, I'm not gonna sing, you really don't want that, but here are its opening lyrics translated. Love is a rebellious bird that no one can tame. And then, in a later verse, the bird you thought you had caught beat its wings and flew away. Love stays away, you wait and wait, when least expected, there it is. In the original opera, Carmen is singing this as a sort of tease to potential suitors. Although Ellie and Carl did get married already, the song still serves as a tease, the rebellious bird that has sadly flown away from him. The parallels with Muntz's literal pursuit of a bird is also not lost on us. While Up does not really follow the plot of Carmen in general, thankfully for Ellie, its thematic usage is a stroke of sheer genius. The rest of Act 1 is used to introduce Russell, as well as throw in a few tools for Carl to use later in his adventure. It's really effective at pulling the rug out from under us, from this romantic world of adventure so far. This is a grimly realistic and modern world, one without wonder, and Carl has basically stopped living in it. There is some rather pointed commentary about how the world has given up on its elderly population, and would rather shove them out of the way when becoming inconvenient to corporate interests. Reminds me a lot of The Incredibles' cynical take on the inhumanity of corporations. That boss guy almost looks like an alien in this film. They're careful to portray the actual employees as just trying to get by and do their jobs. Instead, Pixar squarely points the finger at the system itself that is inhuman. The unfurling of the balloons on Carl's house is absolutely breathtaking. The sort of reveal that we all know is coming, but still blows us completely away. It's just that juxtaposition that's so beautiful about it. That magical feeling that this house is floating between skyscrapers, people on the street looking at it in awe. You get the sense that this might be a significant moment for this child, that there is still wonder and adventure in this modernized world. The whole thing is supported by Michael Giacchino's gorgeous musical score, a melody that lilts and soars like, balloons in the wind. I'm sorry. But just in general, it's a seriously amazing soundtrack from start to finish. After they arrive in Paradise Falls, the film basically becomes reverse Monsters, Inc. in terms of the character dynamic. From a structural standpoint, the two films are similar in how they center around an escort mission with two side characters. Also Up has Doug, but we'll set him aside for now. In Monsters, Inc., we have our main character Sully, who loves Boo and wants to get her home, and his buddy Mike, who doesn't get it. In Up, we have our main character Carl, who doesn't care, and his sidekick Russell, who loves Kevin and wants to get her home. From a narrative perspective, Up's dynamic is a little cleaner and leads to more direct conflict. It's Carl's journey we're going along with. If there's going to be character growth, it's more rewarding for him to eventually come around. Carl, therefore, gets a more pronounced character arc than Sully. On the other hand, Monsters, Inc. is more successful in making us care about the object of the escort mission, Boo, which is where I'd argue Up loses me a little. Boo is always going to inherently have the advantage here, being a human character and all, but I feel Up is weirdly a victim of its own success when it comes to Kevin. The film is really, really good at making us care about Carl in Act 1. Like we so desperately want to be happy and have his adventure and that grand gesture for Ellie. We get really invested in him. When Kevin shows up, it becomes harder to immediately shift gears and invest in her story. Kevin is obviously funny, love the way she mimics Carl and plays with Russell, but they don't immediately lock her into the story. There's no immediate sense that Kevin is in direct danger and we should be worried about her babies. Sure, the dogs are around, but they've been chasing birds for over 50 years now. They don't lock Kevin into the plot until later on, when she hurts her leg. Some of this is obviously intentional, considering we're so firmly on Team Carl so far. Supposedly, this is just a dumb distraction from the real story, a simple task about getting a house on a cliff. Monsters, Inc. has an easier path for investment because our protagonist quickly gets invested in this goal. The two major character relationships are pivoting around him. Up has to do this through an intermediary, through Russell. I really care about Carl's relationship with Russell, therefore I care about Kevin by extension. I do get there in the end, but it's more out of principle than actually caring about Kevin as a character. Kevin could honestly be anything in this plot. This is a good spot to circle back and address Russell's role in the story. He's obviously used as the character foil that Pixar likes to do so much, but what's particularly effective about him, compared to others, is that it hits upon a multi-generational thing, that it says something about how the world has evolved. They cleverly make him a member of the Wilderness Explorers, immediately linking him to Carl, but in a slightly different way. Carl and Ellie, on the fly, make up a little club for fun, proclaiming, "Adventure is out there." Russell, by contrast, joins an organized club that proclaims, "The wilderness must be explored." They both collect badges, but Russell lives in a world less about outdoor adventure and more about tasks and checkmarks. Russell is, in general, extremely adorable and amusing, bringing some much-needed levity to the film. The story desperately needs an injection of cheerful optimism, otherwise Carl will drag it down, and Russell is largely successful at it. He serves as a nice audience surrogate as well. the one observing when the story is getting a little too crazy or when Carl is being a little too unreasonable. I love his pleading of, "It's a talking dog," to persuade Carl. It really highlights how completely myopic Carl has become with his task, that a talking dog doesn't even deter him. Pixar does provide Russell with some depth, sprinkling in these little fireside chats between him and Carl. Pixar tends to use this sort of middle approach when it comes to subtlety in their dialogue, and Russell's backstory is a prime example of their technique. Russell does not straight up say, "My parents are divorced," nor does he merely open-endedly describe the situation with his dad and Phyllis. Pixar instead goes with the line, "Phyllis isn't my mom," not saying divorce directly, just leaving that tiny gap there to fill in. They do something similar with how they portray Ellie's infertility, as well as Muntz revealing what happened to other explorers. It feels like a decent compromise to allow the younger audience to follow these story threads, because they still are important, but not write them in the most cliched and brain-dead way possible. This scene also solidifies one of the major themes of Up, which is the nature of promises and what they can do to people. Carl makes two separate promises. One to Ellie at the beginning to take her to Paradise Falls, and one later with Russell to get Kevin home. Pixar is particularly effective in the repeated use of the "cross your heart" mantra to drive this shared theme home. We also have the example of Charles Muntz, who promises he'll never return home until he captures the bird. Up's take regarding promises is kind of fascinating, a look at the concept we don't usually get in animation. It's not just a boring, "you should keep your promises." It takes a slightly darker view of them, suggesting that people get completely tied up by their unfulfilled promises and lose perspective of what's actually important. Obviously, Charles Muntz goes off the deep end in terms of not being able to fulfill his promise. He gives that lengthy and haunting soliloquy about how long it's been and how many dogs he's lost in his efforts. He never shakes out of it and says, "Hey, maybe this one thing isn't worth it." His promise effectively poisoned his brain. With Carl, it's more of the myopic focus that's the problem. He and Ellie have their life goal together, one that goes unfulfilled, and it eventually becomes the only thing he actually cares about, even for a talking dog. Now, to Carl's credit, he isn't a complete and total stick in the mud about it. He does agree to escort Kevin home when it's convenient, even making that promise to Russell. But it's clear which of Carl's promises he'll commit to when the fat hits the fire. This is easily the film's darkest moment, the real test of where Carl's priorities lie. I admit, I think Russell is a little hard on Carl right here, criticizing him for trying to put out the fire. Saving Kevin is probably not realistic at this point. Muntz and his dogs are right there. But the point is that Carl didn't even try, so I get it. Speaking of the house, we should probably address what is essentially the heart of this film. It's literally following Carl all through Act 2. It's kind of a big plot element. But first, let's take a look at Up in context to Pixar's other work. Pixar kind of went through something as a studio during their middle years. It's funny describing Pixar like they're one person, but I mean the studio as a whole in terms of their projects. They made Wall-E, followed by Up, followed by Toy Story 3. 3 films in a row that all fundamentally say something about the nature of materialism. More specifically, focusing on the values and memories that we place in physical objects. These 3 films tackle this subject in 3 different levels and intensities, with Up taking the middle approach of the 3. More specifically, Up deals with how people over time come to fetishize their material possessions. They romanticize, obsess over them, and view these objects as a substitution for real, actual people. Now, to Carl's credit, he does have a very good reason for fetishizing his house and his possessions. Pixar does a very nice job in Act 1 demonstrating how these possessions represent his memories of his beloved Ellie. He literally talks to his mailbox as if it were Ellie, and later does the same thing with the house itself. Even Russell joins in on the fun. Overall, Pixar presents a sympathetic and understanding view of how someone becomes so personally close to their material things. But Pixar also does an excellent job presenting the darker side of this. How, in a giant storm, Carl would rather spend his time tying down and saving stuff than protecting himself or Russell. Same thing happens with Kevin later on. Instead of seeing Paradise Falls himself, he is literally weighing himself down because his stuff is more important than actual experiences. Again, it's a talking dog. This is the most beautiful and poignant moment in the entire film, in my opinion. The moment of Carl understanding it was all these moments, the actual time spent together with Ellie, that actually mattered. That this grand gesture, this grand fulfillment of a childhood promise, that is less important. It syncs up nicely with his chat with Russell, how Russell comments that it's the boring stuff, like counting cars, that people remember the most. Carl is now free to be able to throw out all that stuff that is weighing him down. This isn't exactly the Toy Story movies, where we'd now cry about how the poor dresser is sad about Carl abandoning him. Material possessions have their place and can still have meaning for people, hence the chairs, but they can't control our lives. Up is a masterclass in presenting a nuanced and balanced look at our relationship with our possessions. Then we go to the climax, a lot of action in the sky with the Zeppelin. As much as we talked about Up as this touchy-feely emotional film, it's still a very, very action-oriented story. Lots of sequences exploiting gravity with those balloons, running away from dogs at the cliffs with Russell flying about, using the house as a counterweight to float over chasms. Up is probably not the best film for people who have suspension of disbelief issues, because it will certainly challenge you. Every animated film has a main gimmick, a mental hurdle that the audience has to buy into. That your toys are alive. That a rat can control a chef with his hair. That your emotions are actually personified beings. Up is obviously everything related to the house, the feasibility of this plan and the physics issues therein. To watch Up, you gotta buy into this premise. I did not consult a panel of physicists for this review, because without this being possible, there's no movie. They do play pretty fast and loose with the helium levels, but as a whole, this is still mostly within our central magical conceit. So let's not worry about the physics. Then they introduce the talking dogs, and I'm like, okay, kinda challenging me here. I guess it's possible Muntz is a crazy super genius, and these are possible. I mean, they did establish his mechanical skill in Act 1. I'm still on board. But then we get to the climax with the actual dogfighting in planes, and I'm out. Nope, sorry. This is a Looney Tunes movie now. I'm on the fence about whether Up is just a very balanced film, or if it's actually tonally dissonant. You know what I mean? There's a bit of a self-conflict in this film, that it wants to be this poignant story about Carl's issues with an element of whimsical adventure, but it also wants to be a silly film starring a talking dog and a sassy bird. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love Doug. Like, he is the guy. The vocal performance is so doofy and likable, he steals every scene he's in. But I don't know if I need The Secret Life of Pets jammed into my adventure with Carl. It's a weird marriage. I criticized Finding Nemo for getting Coral out of the way, but it does lead to a film with a more consistent tone. Up has a more challenging battle, balancing all these disparate elements, and I don't think it quite gets there tonally. It doesn't really matter what the adventure is, I kinda wish they had gone with something more pulpy. Charles Muntz is ultimately a satisfying villain, someone thematically similar to Carl that he can overcome. Like, Carl is literally battling with his romanticized idol of adventure. I appreciate what a total bastard he is, that Pixar doesn't pull any punches about this guy being totally willing to murder people. Love the sequence of him sword fighting with Carl, destroying all of his past work in the process. Pixar does a ridiculously good job getting all of those callbacks in here. It's almost like a point-and-click adventure game. Russell uses leaf blower with balloons. Carl uses tennis ball on dogs. Carl uses chocolate on Kevin. Now it does have a pretty cliche Disney death, that giant fall from a great height, but hey, it's thematic here. That look on Muntz's face is haunting. We finish at Russell's Wilderness Explorer ceremony, which is like the perfect ending for this thing. I really like how it links up with the film's discussion of promises. Russell held up his promise of assisting Carl to Paradise Falls, and Carl, likewise, was there for him. It also breaks the sort of vicious cycle that Carl himself had been in. That Russell put himself through so much stuff to force his father to be there at the ceremony, and that Russell doesn't have to keep killing himself going for this lofty goal that's just gonna keep going unfulfilled. Carl and Russell can now enjoy their boring moments together that are so memorable. Also his mom, but she wasn't really in this movie. I guess she was taking all the pictures? Oh, and the house lands on Paradise Falls. Aww. I still think Monsters, Inc. has the best closing shot, but this is a really close second. As you can probably tell from this review, Up is another one of those Pixar films that I have trouble viewing in a vacuum. After all, we've looked at comparisons to Monsters, Inc., Finding Nemo, WALL-E, and Toy Story 3, 4 very different films. This isn't because Up is unoriginal, it's actually probably one of their most unique and imaginative films. I think it's because Up is such a central film to the studio, one of those that kind of links everything together. It hits on just so many of Pixar's favorite themes they like to tackle. Adventure, memories, grief, materialism, our changing priorities, how parents affect their children. The only thing it's missing is a coming-of-age story. Maybe Coco will do that. There's a small part of me, the most depressed and pretentious part, that wishes Pixar just went for it with this film and didn't adhere to all those typical Disney animation conventions. Up kind of feels like a film that wants to push boundaries, but is ultimately very self-aware about its intended audience. And as much as we all love that first act in that montage, I don't know if anyone would put up with an hour and a half of exploring those feelings. Sure, the final product ends up being all over the place tonally, but it's more out of design than being an unintended side effect. Whatever adventure Pixar picks for this story is gonna be jarring. That's the whole point of the movie. It's a talking dog. So instead of fetishizing Act 1 so much, maybe we should all just sit back and enjoy the squirrel ride. Thanks for watching. I blame Doug.